very small percentage of their capital is invested in China. But I advising.
Hello everyone. Hello. Ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention please? Please have a seat and we should get started shortly.
Nice talking with
And
you.
before I introduce you the speaker, I think Richard has an announcement to make. And would you please let people know about our next exciting event?
Yes, I will. Thank you. Thank you, Raj. My name is Richard Colligan. I'm the treasurer of the DC Alumni Chapter of Beta Gamma Sigma. As Raj mentioned, thank you guys all for being here for the event. I wanted to bring your attention to an upcoming event we have next week, which is in celebration of the 100th year anniversary of Beta Gamma Sigma. Chapters nationwide are participating in a day of service. Here in DC, we've elected to participate in a hunger drive sponsored and spearheaded by NBC that is titled Food for Families and involves bringing non-perishable items, putting them into baskets, and delivering them to families in need throughout the DC and the greater Washington metropolitan area. That'll be going on next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. You can come at whatever time is convenient for your schedule. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, again, however much you can give. But the work will be appreciated. Again, this is going to needy families and folks who may not even be able to afford a Thanksgiving meal of any description. So the help is greatly appreciated and will be greatly appreciated by us as well as the families. If you'd like more information, you can go to bgsdc.org, which is the local chapter's website. There's an event registration page, has further details. The event will be taking place at the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Washington, which is in Southeast on Bennington Road. That information is also on the website. Again, it's next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. at the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Washington. All the information is on the website, bgsdc.org. And if you have questions about any of that, I'll be here afterwards. I'm happy to speak to you. We're trying to put together a group, so if I can give you my information, we can set up a carpool or a meeting place, come from here and go to there, if that's convenient for people, whatever works. We just want to get as many folks there as possible. So I'm available for questions. Thanks for your time. And without further ado, we'll bring up our featured speaker.
Thank you, everybody, for taking the time and the trouble to come. I hope I can make this interesting. I guess I don't need to talk about my background and stuff because that's already been.
That's on the website and event registration. That's fine.
So before we start, maybe I should preface what we're going to talk about by a few points that I think I should make at the outset to provide a setting for this presentation. As you know, this is a topic which is not new, and there's been a lot of activity in public-private partnerships around the world for several years now. And there are several thousand papers and books and publications already in the bank of knowledge on this. And a lot of it is available on the internet, and a lot of it is available in the websites of the various different development agencies. So I will try to focus on a few things that I think, just going beyond the fundamentals, is useful for people to know and realize about this particular vehicle, if I can call it that, public-private partnership. I'll focus on some of the main lessons that we've learned in trying to implement these things around the world. And I won't go into too much detail about, there's a lot of detail we can cover, and I won't go into that. I'll just hit the highlights. The other thing I'd like to say is that in terms of examples, I'll not go into too many, for two reasons. One is that there is a lot of political sensitivity to a lot of these things. And in particular, I tried to avoid talking about private-public partnerships in the US, because there are a lot of political sensitivities on that. So I shall talk about these things in general terms and talk about examples internationally. So if I'm allowed that leeway, I shall continue. So let me see. Oops. Oh, sorry. Okay. So today I'll try to cover just a brief discussion as to what these things are, and I'm sure that most of you are aware in one way or to some extent what a public-private partnership is. I'll talk a little bit about why and when to do them and when not to. Some description about how they are done, and in this particular area there's a lot of literature. This is what most of the material talks about, which is how you implement them. But I'm going to talk more about the issues behind these partnerships. I'll give you some examples, and I'll talk about some of the key lessons. And these are lessons that we have learned from actual experience. A lot of it may not be actually even there in the literature yet. So I hope that you will find that to be interesting. And I'll talk a little bit about where public-private partnerships are going in the future. So what are they? I think the best way I can think of defining it is that these partnerships are an agreement between government and the private sector for the provision of a public good or service by the private sector. So it's something that the government has been doing or does normally, which then, for one reason or the other, is found to be more beneficial by involving the private sector. And coming to the last point here, it is a partnership. It needs to be a partnership. We have to think about it as a partnership, not as an adversarial relationship. But that's a very important first premise. They generally involve long-term contracts, user charges, with payments flowing both from the government to the private sector and vice versa. The investments involved in those projects are often shared, but primarily the purpose of doing it is to get the investment from the private sector. And it's also a way of sharing the risks of a project. And sometimes it's better to defray the risk to the private sector under circumstances that warrant that. In other cases, you want to leave the risk with the public sector, and I shall go into the reasons and the background for that also. I guess we'll take questions when we finish, so I'll just go through this. But if you feel like interrupting me, you're welcome to do so. I borrowed this from a European Union document. I thought it was a good way to show the range and the spectrum, so to speak. On the one side, you have things where it's mostly public good or services being provided by the public sector, with some of the engineering and contracting, which is usually always done by the private sector. Not always, but in most cases. And then you can move to the complete other side, where the assets are owned by the private sector, operated by the private sector, built by the private sector, and the government just provides regulatory supervision. And in between, you have several other options like build, operate, transfer, build, own, operate, transfer, and several other types of arrangements and contracts that are involved in public-private partnerships. I don't know if I need to go into the details of this, but we can come back to this later on if you have any questions. Why do we do these? People tend to think that the main reason we do it is because the government doesn't have the money to do it themselves. In other words, there's a lack of fiscal headroom, where the government is maxed out or just doesn't have the ability in its budget to fund something, so you ask the private sector to do it for you. But that is not any one of these can be the sole reason for doing it. But each public-private partnership would necessarily involve one or more of these reasons. As I mentioned, as a way of financing the project when the government doesn't have the funds. This is a very, I can use this, hold on, oops, sorry. This is a very important thing that is often overlooked. If you can imagine a government-owned utility or a government-owned transportation service, like a public bus service. Now, the provider of the service is also the regulator of the service. And so there is this insidious relationship between the two functions. And so there's a lack of accountability, there's there's no separation of functions, there's no balance of responsibilities. So one of the reasons why you do, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. One of the reasons why you do a PPP is you want to separate the regulatory function from the operational function. So you allow those that are best at providing the service or the public good to do that, and then you have the government to provide regulatory oversight and supervision. There's no conflict of interest. You want to remove that. So that is also a very important reason for doing that. In many cases and in many countries, the service is just not available. For example, electricity or water. It's just not there. If you take a country in the Middle East where the water is delivered to the households in an urban situation through tankers twice a week, and they're paying good hard money for it. Now, if you provided them 24-hour piped water, they'd be happy to pay some fee for it, and in all cases, in most cases, it would be a lot less than what they're paying for the tanker. So, a private operator invited in to provide that service, to make the investment, can make that service available where it is not there, and the government doesn't have the funds to provide it. Another reason why you want to do it, again, we talked about accountability. In many of these cases, in many of these partnerships, the contracts are structured in such a way that you're paying for performance, you're paying for output, which in a government situation where the government is providing it, there isn't enough accountability. You can't hold them accountable. But here, you can hold them accountable. So, and I'll come to that later because, sometimes this is one of the mistakes that a lot of people, a lot of PPPs have involved. A lot of mistakes where they totally ignored this aspect of it. And so it was, it defeated the very purpose for doing it. And last but not least, you want to have competition, because that is the best way to ensure that you have an effective and efficient operation, and you have the maximum utilization of the resources that are available. And there are two types of competition in these kinds of partnerships. In many cases, where it's a public good or service, it could be a natural monopoly. So then you have the question of, how can we have competition there? So there's competition for the market, and there's competition in the market. And sometimes you can't have competition in the market because the market is too small. For example, there was a case of a public-private partnership in a country, a small island country in the Middle East, Bahrain. And the market was too small to have more than one operator. So you couldn't have competition in the market. So the PPP contract had to be designed in such a way that there was competition for the market. And there were the duration of the contracts had to be set that the competition for the market provided enough of a deterrent so that it would be almost equivalent to having competition in the market.
Sengupta, can you explain what is competition for the market? What does it exactly
competition
mean?
for the market, if you have a monopoly, take this case this case of public transportation in Bahrain, where a private operator was invited in to replace all the buses and operate the bus service in the city. Now, there couldn't be more than one operator, so there was no competition, there couldn't be competition in the market. But the operator who would get the franchise to run the buses in the city would have to compete with other potential operators for getting that contract.
I see.
So that's competition for the market. So you need to have both, either one or the other, or both. In another country in the Middle East, say Amman, Jordan, where also there was a PPP for the bus service, the market was large enough to allow more than one operator to operate in the marketplace. Now, looking at some of the criteria, and I borrowed this from a slide from the World Bank. There's an economic rate of return, which is the social benefit, the social welfare, and you have the financial rate of return, which is what an investor looks for. And so the question is, if you have a very high economic rate of return, but a very a low financial rate of return, then while it's beneficial for society to have this service, a private operator cannot make money doing it. So in the case of a partnership, the government has to subsidize or participate as an investor or in some other way. So that's where it's really a partnership. On the other hand, if the economic rate of return is very low, but the financial rate of return is very high, then you don't need the government to be involved at all. And then you have, where both are high, then you have a case for a good public-private partnership. So that's one of the ways in which to determine the criteria in deciding whether or not to do this. This slide talks about implementation, and it's a very important consideration that is often overlooked by practitioners who are involved in doing public-private partnerships. And I wanted to bring this up because, especially in developing countries, this is a very key consideration. And we're talking about two things, and I don't think you can read this very well because of the print. This is benefit to the community, which is similar but not the same as economic rate of return that we talked about in the last slide. And this is ease of implementation. Now, when deciding to do a public-private partnership particularly in an emerging market, you need to look at both of these. How much of a benefit is it going to be for the people by doing this? But can you really do it? Will the government, will the vested interests let you do it? How much political capital do you need to spend to attract the private capital that you need in order to do the thing? And there has to be a balance there. And if it's extremely difficult to implement, even if the returns are very high, it's going to take a very long time, and it may never happen, and you would spend a lot of energy and political capital trying to do it, and it would never get done. On the other hand, if it's very easy to do but it has no benefit, then you don't want to do it anyway. So there has to be a balance of this, and especially those of you who are interested in working in development, in international development or in emerging markets, this is a very key consideration, and you will not find this discussed in too much of the literature. There's only very little written on this subject. But this is what the actual practitioner encounters in these countries. This is another slide I took from the World Bank. It shows how these are done. This is the implementation part. And I'm not, since it's hardly legible, I don't think you all can read this. So I'll skip this and go to the next one, which I'll cover these things, but I'll cover them in the context of what our experience tells us you should or shouldn't do. So first step in a public-private partnership is project identification. And we talked about some of the criteria before. And one of the things that, and this is sometimes I would say in some ways my personal view, but it's a view that's shared by many others. You don't want to do a public-private partnership just for the sake of doing one. In other words, if you're having a service which is okay, it's running fine, it's being financed, maybe it's not the perfect thing, but it's there, you have coverage, you're being able to handle the demand growth, leave it alone. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think that's the first lesson in public-private partnerships. You don't want to do it for the sake of doing it. And I said that I will not talk about the US, but there are several cases where that has not been applied. The next is the pre-feasibility and appraisal. I've kind of lumped these two together. Now, this is the most important stage. This is, it's a pre-feasibility and appraisal is where you do the back of the envelope, you do the preliminary analysis, preliminary feasibility analysis. It's not a bankable feasibility study, but you do enough work, enough research and analysis to determine whether or not the project is viable, whether or not it should be done. And this is where you need to make the go, no-go decision. You don't make the go, no-go decision after doing a full-fledged feasibility study. Because it's already, by the time you're into that, it becomes like a fait accompli and it has momentum of its own and it keeps on going even though it, and it ends up being a white elephant at some stage. So this is the stage where the go, no-go decision really has to be made. And everything is in a continuum, so most of the go, no-go, if you think of it as a bell curve, most of the go, no-go decisions have to be in this range here. I mean, there are some that, fall outside the range and are exceptions. The one thing that everybody forgets in a PPP is this one. And country after country after country, we have seen this problem where it is a wonderful project, everything is perfect, but the public never knew about it. And when it happened, it was a shock, and you have people burning buses and all kinds of stuff happening. So a proactive public relations program is a must for every PPP. And most governments don't realize this, including here in the US. Although I said I would talk about it. Feasibility study. Everybody wants to do a feasibility study. They spend $700,000, $800,000, $1.5 million to do a feasibility study for a PPP. There's no need for it. There's no need for it because the private investor is going to do his own feasibility study. He is not going to rely on one that the government or the USGDA did for them. Okay? So that's a waste of money, but everybody wants to do it for some reason. Now, there are some cases where you do need to do one. And why do you need to do one? You need to do one if you need the data it generates for preparing the RFP. And in some like in a say a rapid transit system, a light rail system, or a bridge, a very big bridge, you need to generate the data that you need to put in the RFP for it to be credible enough for people to bid on it. Then you need to do a feasibility study. But in most other cases, you don't need a bankable feasibility study for a PPP. The investor is going to come and do it anyway. The next is the regulatory framework. You see, what a PPP does, and we talked about it before, it separates the regulatory function from the operational function in providing a public good or service. Now, what you've done when you put in a PPP is you have put in a private operator, and the regulatory framework that governs a public sector enterprise is very different from that what is needed to supervise and govern a private sector enterprise. And so if you do a PPP and you don't put in the regulatory framework, including the institutional structure, the institutions that you need, then you have a disaster in your hands waiting to happen. And again, in country after country, we have found this to be the case. You know, they do a nice PPP, but there's no regulatory framework to supervise the private operator. So you get all kinds of bizarre situations happening, which would, you would think that, nobody in his right mind would be doing, but it happens. So, regulatory framework has to be designed, and its implementation plan has to be put in place simultaneously with the implementation of the PPP. And in most cases, even today, that doesn't happen. And that's what causes a lot of the problems and heartaches afterwards. The next is the RFP and the contract design. And there's a lot written on this, so I won't talk too much about it, except to say that most practitioners prefer a two-stage technical and financial bid with the pass-fail on the technical. And what often happens is this takes a long time to actually get instituted. So what you do is you design the regulatory framework, but you know that some of it may have to go into Parliament, some of it has to be approved by different interest groups and so forth, and it may take a long time. So what you want to do is you want to put in surrogate regulations in the contract itself with a phase out. So as and when your regulatory and institutional framework kicks in, these provisions in the contract get phased out. So you word the contract saying that the regulatory framework supersedes this, and once it comes into effect, it replaces that. The institutional arrangements, it's very important to have this in place even before the PPP is tendered. Who's going to do the tendering? Who's the approval authority? Who's going to implement the transition? Who's going to supervise the contract? Unless you set up these units or delegate these responsibilities to existing, I'm not saying expanded bureaucracy, but unless you make provisions for this up front, everything is going to be open season. And when we talk about examples, I'll come to that. Unless you have the institutional arrangements in place, the PPP is going to be more or less out of control. And in many countries, there is just not enough capacity to manage these things. And it's a very nice idea, but you have to have the ability to manage these things as they go through the implementation process. And unless you have the functions and the responsibilities in place, it's a disaster waiting to happen. And that's what makes the difference between a successful and a not so successful PPP. And in one of the examples, I'll talk about that. In the tendering process, international competitive bidding is the preferable way to go for the large projects. Even if that, has some national implications, it's always the better approach. Then the other stages are the selection, negotiations, and contract. Again, you need to have the institutional arrangements in place so that you have the people available to do these things. To do who's going to do the negotiations? Who's going to deal with the lawyers? All of these things have to be decided up front, and the people have to be identified, given the responsibilities. If some regulation needs to be enacted, it has to be enacted. If they have to be empowered to do it, some government decree or whatever needs to be put in place so that they have the authority to do what needs to be done. Then you have the financial closing, and then the regulatory framework has to be implemented. So this is in a nutshell, and there's a lot written on this. Oftentimes in large projects, one of the things that people don't realize is that between the contract and the financial closing can be a very long time. And unless and until everything has been thought through properly, many projects come here, you have a commercial closing, but you don't get to the financial closing. And there are several projects around the world where this has happened. Everything was done, but they couldn't get the financing together for the project because it had some inherent flaws in it, some fatal flaws in it, which only come to the surface when you do the financial, when you come to this. So one of the lessons here is that in large projects, you need to think about the financing along with the design of the project. And it's often very useful to have the potential lenders get in on the ground floor, to be involved with the project, be familiar with the project as it proceeds. So when the time comes, and the big banks, they know if it's a large corporate investor, they know each other, but they don't know the project. So having that is a very useful thing. But that's going into a level of detail that I didn't want to get into. Okay, some examples. And I said I wouldn't talk about many examples, so I've kept this list short. And if anyone is interested, I'm happy to talk afterwards about specific issues. Chile, they've done quite a few PPPs, and most of them have been very successful. And the reason is that they thought through the whole process. They put in the regulations, they put in the institutions, they delegated the responsibilities, and all of these things were in place as the transactions took place. On the other hand, in Mexico, it was kind of the opposite. And not only that, there's another issue which we'll come to, but I'll just mention it now in the context of this. You need to balance the interest of the public, with the interest of the investor. And if you tilt too much towards the interest of the public and don't think enough about the interests of the investor, it's not going to be a successful project. And vice versa. And what they did here was they had a lot of things in those projects which were not viable propositions. But they put it through the bidding process, some people won, and then it was all, it all became a big mess. They had toll roads with roads beside that were without tolls. And so, and that was part of the requirement. And, there were a lot of things, but this is a question of the balance, and we'll talk about that. Some of the good ones, I talked about Bahrain, that was a good example, although they did make the mistake of the regulatory framework. I mean, they were very slow in putting that in place, and it created problems. But overall, it was a good project. Jordan was a was a very good project. A lot of people in Amman were unemployed because they couldn't get from A to B without taking a taxi, because there was no bus service. Once the bus service was put in, people could actually go across town and go to work every day. Not, they did it, before it used to take 4 hours for someone to go to a place of employment, so that, it didn't work. And that time got reduced to like half an hour. So it was a huge benefit for the citizens, and it was there was a lot of competition because there were more than one operator. The regulatory framework was well thought through, not perfect. There were problems. In every one of these cases there were problems. There's nothing free of problems, but it was by and large a good one. In this particular one, this is a standing example of how not to do a PPP. They were so proud when this thing closed, the government, that they drove a bargain, they got the best deal. And after they closed, what happened was for 3 weeks, the garbage was not collected, piled up this high on the streets of Bahrain. Because the winner of the bid decided that this is not something that he was going to make money on, so he just left. So, again, you have to balance the public with the private interests. And unless you do that right, you can be a hero by driving a hard bargain, but if it's not going to be interesting for the investor, at the end of the day, it's not going to be a viable project. Bucharest water supply was a very good project. They reduced the losses significantly. They improved the service. There were a lot of positive things that happened in that project. By the same token, here in Mumbai, India, the focus was on more water. See, using a term, to produce the water, the capital you need to produce the water is 6 times as much as the capital you need to stop the leaks for the same volume of water. And so when they designed this project, they focused on generating more water because there was not enough water, but they were losing 40% of the water in leaks. So that project was not a very successful. And there are many ways of stopping leaks, by balancing the load, and there's a lot of ways. You don't have to even invest money. Just by scheduling the pumps, you can, save water. And municipal parks in Bulgaria, this was it was not a well thought out thing. They said we'll get the private sector to manage the parks, and then they took the land and they started doing other things with it. There were no more parks. So anyway, so these are some examples. But there are many others. So the key lessons. I think this part of the thing is really what I wanted to talk about. These next 3 or 4 slides. It's in every PPP. The most important thing is to balance the private sector's interest with the public sector's interest. I mean, that is the key to the whole thing. And that has to be incorporated in the legal and regulatory framework, in the institutional structure, in the tariff regimes. You want to give enough incentive to the private sector to invest, but at the same time you don't want it to be onerous, especially on the poorer sections of the population. So the tariff regime has to be designed properly. The one thing that you need to avoid in PPPs is what we call fate control. It's very tricky to give the private sector fate control over the consumers of the private or the public. And this is there's an inherent conflict of interest in that. And I think very recently there was a case in one of the states where they had these halfway houses, juvenile detention centers, where, I mean, that was an extreme case of where fate control was given to the private sector, and it corrupted the whole process.
What do you mean by fate control?
You have control over an individual's fate.
Oh.
I said I wouldn't talk about US examples, but I'll give you. And this is, in other countries this happens also, where it's in the interest of, this is talking about privately run prisons. It's in the interest of the operator to have a large prison population, that's how they get paid, and prolong the stay. Now, good behavior, who decides the good behavior? People who are running the prison. You know, you have issues like that. So, fate control is one thing that has to be very carefully looked at when designing a PPP. So that's something that is often overlooked. And competition is a must. There has to be competition in order to be able to properly balance the public and the private interest. We talked about priorities. I think in a previous case we talked about priorities. In other words, in designing the PPP, you have to also look at the sector and figure out what the priorities are for the sector. And based on that, the design of the PPP, the contract, all of those things should follow from that. If you don't, then you have bizarre situations. For example, coverage and demand growth. This is one way of looking at it. Demand growth is how fast the demand is growing, and coverage is what percentage of the population is receiving the service. So I don't know if this is. I don't know if you all can read what's written there, but I've tried to. And this is a very, very important issue that is often overlooked by a lot of people. If you have high coverage and low demand growth, that means the product or the service life cycle has reached a point where it's mature. So you don't need that much investment anymore. So the priority is to reduce costs and make it more efficient. So if you're in that quadrant, priority is high for cost reduction, but priority for investment is low. So when you design the transaction, you design incentives and penalties where you're not so concerned about whether or not the operator is going to make a lot of investment, but you are concerned about whether or not he's going to keep the costs down. A good example would be an O&M PPP for a road. The road has already been built, so there is not a need for a lot of investment, but there is need for maintenance and proper operation at a lower cost to keep the tariffs down. So that's then the design of the contract and the regulatory regime, the tariff regime, the competitive structure has to be such that it promotes cost reduction over investment. On the other hand, if you have very high demand growth but low coverage, like in many developing countries, then you want to give as much incentive as possible to the private operator to make the investments that are required. You are concerned about effect of efficiency and cost control, but if you don't have the service, whether you have a high cost or a low cost is irrelevant. So if you're in this quadrant, the sector priority is investment. Cost reduction is important, and cannot be overlooked, but this takes precedent. Investment takes precedent. So you have to design the contracts that way, the tariff regime that way, the risk allocation that way. You have to, reduce the risk of the investor as much as possible, so he's more motivated to make the investments. So the design of the PPP has to be such that you get this result. Now, this quadrant is interesting. When you have high demand growth and high coverage, your priority is higher on investment. Cost reduction is also important, but not as important as investment. Now, I don't know if you all remember the power electricity market debacle in California some years ago. What happened there was exactly this. They were in this quadrant, but they designed the regulatory regime for this quadrant. And so you had this huge problem where nobody was investing. There was a lot of competition granted, but there were margins fell to the point where it wasn't worthwhile making the investments, and you started having blackouts and brownouts. I mean, there were other things also, like, the gas suppliers were playing games. Those are other things. But those are also factors. But the main factor was this. The regulatory strategy was here, whereas the sector was here. So it's very important to do a full analysis of the sector and see what the priorities are. And then when you're doing the PPP, the contracts have to be designed to address that. Otherwise, you have, you're at cross purposes. This is the other lesson. See, this kind of and I borrowed this also, I think from one of the World Bank documents. This illustrates the PPP. In the case of the government makes the investment, then the service is provided over the life of the project. Whereas in a PPP, the government makes some investment, maybe small, private sector makes most of the investments, but then the public or the government pays over the life of the project, either in user fees or other charges, reimbursements. Now, the thing that is often not done is, and this is amazing that, very sophisticated governments and countries have, when they do these projects, they don't do this homework. The present value of this, the present value of this has to be less than the present value of this for it to make sense. Otherwise, you're much better off trying to somehow borrow the money and do it yourself. Of course, there are other issues like efficiency and cost control and so forth. But, and I'm not talking about marginal differences. I mean, there are cases where the present value here was almost double or triple the present value here of the cost to the government and the public. And you could say it was due to bad analysis, it could have been due to vested interests, corruption, we don't know. But the checks and balances have to be there to prevent that kind of thing. I'm not talking about, if it's if it's 20 or 30% this way, that way, okay, fine, that's different. But if it's double or triple, then you've got to think about it. Yes?
When you talk about present value, you talk about numbers.
Yeah.
But benefit may not be numerical. It's not always money.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is one of the factors. That's why I'm saying if it's if it's just a few percentage points here and there, you don't worry about it, because then you look at the other factors. But if the difference is so huge you know, see what happens, then you could have.
What does it say about the benefit for the community?
This is the benefit for the community.
Right, but benefit of the community is not monetary.
Sorry?
It's
No,
not
no,
monetary.
it's
So
an
how can you
economic value.
calculate present value of
So
that?
this is, no, you don't calculate the present value of the benefit. You calculate the present value only of the cost.
Aha. Okay.
You assume the present value, the ceteris paribus, the benefits are the same in both cases. And you look at the cost. This is just the fiscal analysis
Of just the cost.
of just the cost. Of course, there's something wrong with this chart. Can anyone tell me what's wrong with this chart? There is some cost here as well for the government, which is not shown. Which it's less than this, but there is a cost, and that's not shown. But anyway, so this is an important check. Also, the reason I bring this up is because wherever this has been an issue, it's been an issue. I don't think because of bad analysis. It's been an issue because of vested interests or corruption. So this is a litmus test for it, in a way, to check for that. There are several projects. There were projects in Pakistan, there were projects in Indonesia, where this test would have immediately shown that something was wrong with this power project. So, sorry, there was somebody wanting to ask something? Yes.
Just the analysis or projection of what the public costs would be in a private finance project then would be a much larger undertaking though than trying to measure what that initial investment would be if it was fully publicly financed. Because over the course of those years, as the chart shows anyway, public sector still is a more variable or smaller level of, or actually higher level of investment than over the years of the public finance project. I guess is that one of the sort of main challenges of that of doing a PPP then is actually projecting years and years into the future. What is going to be the cost to the government? Is it going to be worth it to us to whether it's creating the incentives to the private sector to make the investments or actual operating costs? That seems to be then, I guess, a particular challenge posed to.
Yes. Yes. Most of these infrastructure projects, which is typically what we talk about for these PPPs, there are usually long-term projects. 20 years, 30-year projects. Especially when there's a huge chunks of investments that have been made that can only be amortized over a long period of time. So, like a road, you give a 30-year concession. So you need to take into account the entire life cycle cost of the project. And a lot of it is projection, but this part is all contractual. It's in the contract already. What you don't know is what this missing part would be. But all of these costs here are in the contract. So you know what they are, what they're projected to be. So you can do the numbers. And of course there are contingencies and escalation clauses, other things that you can't predict. Probabilistic issues are there. But by and large you can do the calculations. And I'm talking about the real world, where I think this test is a clean giveaway that there's something wrong, something else is going on with the project. So that's a check that should always be done. Finally, renegotiation. You did the best contract in the world. Everything is perfect. Guess what? Year and a half later, the guy comes along, says, sorry, I'm having this problem, that problem. We need to raise the tariffs. we need to raise the toll. And you've had this, I'm sure you've experienced this yourselves driving through toll booths places. The average, this is interesting, there are several studies done on this. The average year to renegotiation, average time to is about 1.5 to 3.5 years. Unbelievable as that may sound, but that is in fact what the statistics show. And so why do they come back to renegotiate? You know, in some cases it's winner's remorse, bidder's remorse. Like, you know, they bid too low, and then after winning they were happy, then they realized, like in the Bahrain case, where actually they were not happy to begin with, but in any event. So you win the bid and then you realize that this is not something that's going to be viable for you. Now, there are a lot of bidders who do this as a strategic tool. They bid low, and this has been in a lot of the projects in Latin America. This was the case, where and in many cases it was U.S. firms, and it was also some European firms. They came in and won those bids knowing that they were going to come back and renegotiate after they won. And the reason they did that was because once you win, the government has spent enough political capital. It's been advertised. The president has announced the project. And everybody has said it's such a nice thing. And now if something goes wrong with it, it's a huge political liability. And the bidder knows that.
It's a bait and switch.
So he's got you, you know, by your shirt collar after he's won, he or she got you by shirt collar after they've won the bid. So a lot of people do that as a strategy, a strategic approach to the bidding process. Now, in some cases, it's also the government's fault. They don't design the project right. They cut corners, and then after the bidding has been done and the contract has been awarded, they say, oh, I need that little thing over there, and I need that little thing over there, and maybe this width of the road should be another foot more, or you know. So that gives an excuse to the bidder now to come back and renegotiate. And a lot of the renegotiation is due to that also, due to the fault of the government. So the way to prevent this is to have, you know, enough escalation clauses in there so it takes care of most of the unpredictables. Retaining a right to rebid. If they want to renegotiate, you have the right to rebid the project. And this is especially good for O&M contracts, operation and maintenance contract, where they're not actually investing in building the thing, but just running it. So there it's very useful to have. And then, you know, to the extent possible, you have conditions and penalties and all things built in. So if they come to renegotiate, then there are certain penalties involved and so forth. So you provide as much disincentive as possible for them to come back to renegotiate. But this is a problem that will not go away. It can be reduced by diligently designing the contracts and the RFPs as best as possible. But and all you can really do is increase the number of years before they'll come back, but they will come back. So if you're ever working on a PPP, be prepared that whatever you do, they're going to come back to renegotiate. And so you need to have a plan B when they do that. Okay, so outlook. Basically, if you look at the history, most of the activity has been in greenfield projects, PPPs. Most of the investments have been in energy, and although there was a big push in the East, in Europe and Central Asian countries, primarily Russia, the bigger growth area is South Asia. Now you would ask me, why is not East Asia Pacific a growth area? Simply because most of the demand growth is in China, and because of their budget surpluses, they're able to finance most of their projects. So there will be private activity, but a lot of it will be state. So basically, it's South Asia where most of the growth, I think, is likely to occur in the next few years, and it's going to be mostly in energy. Also worldwide, we think that PPPs are going to pick up a lot in the future as the various economies in the world start to recover from the crisis. There will be demand growth, which will prompt need for investment, but their fiscal situation is going to take much longer to improve. So for the foreseeable future, I think the outlook for PPPs is going to be fairly strong.
Where are the concessions? First, to the left there?
Yeah, concessions are like, for example, an airport.
Oh, okay.
You know, you give a concession to an operator who runs the airport. You know, he keeps the revenues. So that's the presentation.
Okay, questions? Go ahead.
One question. You talked about a pipeline where,
Sorry?
you talked about a pipeline, I think it was in Mumbai, India, I think, where it was leaks, but it was, you talked about where it cost more to pump it than it cost the leaks. In terms of, how do you include due diligence in the contract or the feasibility of having a PPP? In a general sense, like if you're building a pipeline to transport water, how do you actually do the due diligence to make sure it actually works? I mean, unless it's in the feasibility phase already.
Yeah. What you do is you know, most of the, if it's an existing water distribution network, they generally have the data. How much water went into the system, and how much billable water came out, how much non-billable water came out, and what the differences were. So they have numbers. Now, it varies from country to country, municipality to municipality. You know, some have better data than others, but you have data. And there are ways of monitoring it as well. So if you don't have the data, you can go and generate, you can take samples and generate. So it's not, I mean, people who are in the business, it's very easy for them to figure out what the loss rates are.
I was talking in particular about, I guess it may come to the area of operation and maintenance.
Yes.
How does one prevent that leakage from occurring in the future if one takes over that particular waterway? Would that be in the feasibility stage, or would that be a clause for
It's a very, very good question. And let me tell you, answer it with an example. In the city of Baku in Azerbaijan, there was a PPP done for the water distribution. The water that came out was provided by the government. Just the distribution was given to the private operator to manage. It was an O&M contract. And the way it was done was that the government was going to subsidize the cost of the water to the operator in the first year, and the subsidy would reduce year by year by year and disappear. And that gave the operator the time to stop the leaks so that the unbilled water could become billable water. Very similar project was done in electricity distribution as well in Baku with the same principle. You know, there are different terms used for this. Some people use the word output-based aid, which is kind of, you know, like we talked about In this slide, we talked about, where is it? The very first, second slide. No, not what they are. Why do them? Here, you pay for performance and output. So that's what that approach was, and this is an approach that is often used in other countries as well, where, you know, especially in distribution. If you take electricity, for example, if you look at the investment and the cost of operating, which are kind of similar, you have 60% of the capital cost is in generation. 30% is in distribution and 10% in transmission. Okay? So, if you were to invest in stopping losses and invested in the distribution to stop losses, for every kilowatt hour that you saved, you would not have to invest for 2 kilowatt hours of capacity in generation. So it's much more efficient to stop losses than to produce more. So that's how, you know, that's the thinking behind doing these PPP contracts, structuring these PPP contracts. And that was the reason why the Mumbai contract was not well thought through.
Please go ahead.
Oh, just me? So, in your experience, how have PPPs, or maybe they haven't, sort of diminished corruption, or help diminish corruption? And what do you do with like the element of corruption in situations where you're trying to create these partnerships?
That's again a very, very good question. And unfortunately, there have been many cases where the PPP has in fact increased corruption in some countries. And in other countries it's reduced corruption. If you remember, you know, how do you know the contract is good or bad? How much competition has there been? Then you look at the deal itself, the structure of the transaction, look at the contract. And often there are a lot of telltale signs as to why it's not a good contract. So it's a question of, you know, how much diligence is exerted, and what the vested interests are, who's lobbying for what. If you take, there was a case, and also the regulatory framework, and how well the regulatory framework is set up, so that the operator can't cheat, for example. See, there's a huge information asymmetry between what the private operator is doing and what the government, the regulatory body, can do. There's a huge authority asymmetry, often. Good example is in one Latin American country, which shall remain unnamed. The head of the regulator was a colonel, but the head of the utility, private operator, was a general. Okay? So now you figure it. Who's going to have more influence, and who's going to prevail in a totalitarian system? So you know, things like that. So, but and the other thing I talked about, which is also very important, that's the litmus test. And it's only one example I gave. There are a lot of other similar tests that you can do to figure out whether or not there is something fishy going on. But by the time you do that, it's already sometimes too late.
So when's the appropriate time to actually do it?
Good question.
I mean,
If I knew the answer to that, then
because you did say earlier that feasibility is like almost always the most important part in the process of having a PPP. But if what I'm hearing is correct, this and the feasibility study almost may be running neck and neck.
no, the feasibility is not always the most important thing. If you go here, where is that? If you go here, the economic rate of return is very high, but the financial rate of return is low. But you can still do a PPP with the government defraying some of the risk or some of the cost. So the project does not always have to be feasible. You may want to do this for reasons other than just the capital. You may want to do it for more efficient operations, better service, better technology. A country could invite an outside operator to come in and operate the system so that it's a better technology, the better operating practices, and you still make the investments. A good example is in Jordan, and actually it ended up being not such a good example afterwards, but at the time it was done, it was a good example. They invited, the water supply company invited a French operator to come and operate the system, to stop the losses and everything else. And it was not a feasible proposition, but they still did that, and they provided the subsidies because of their operating techniques and their operating procedures. They had the know-how of managing a water distribution system, stopping the leaks and managing the pressures. See, you don't have to repair the pipes to stop the leaks. A lot of the leak happens because of the pressure. So when the demand is high, the leaks go down. Because a lot of people are using, there's less pressure in the system. When people are not using the water, the pressure goes up and the leaks increase. So by managing the pressure and the load, you can reduce a lot of the leak by operating procedures without having to really make a lot of investment. And these guys knew how to do that kind of stuff. So it was worthwhile having them, even though the project was not financially feasible. Financial feasibility was low, but it helped increase the supply of water in the city. See?
Okay, one last question.
Which party is typically responsible for the feasibility study perspective? Is that the public or the private?
Can you repeat the question, please, because I could not hear it?
Sorry, I'm asking which party is typically responsible for the feasibility and due diligence, the public or the private?
Yeah. Like I said, if you're doing a PPP, it's generally advisable not to do a bankable feasibility study. Not advisable for the government to do a bankable feasibility study, because the private investor is going to come and do it anyway, because the investor needs that to get the financing. So if the government were to do it, and this is an issue I have with one of the programs of USDDA, where they finance feasibility studies, which in the end are not very useful, because the private investor would come and do it anyway. Where you do need to do the feasibility study is if you need the data it generates to write the RFP. And in very large projects, that's advised. Then you would do a bankable feasibility study, not because you want to get the financing, but that's the only way you can. You need to get to that level of detail in order to be able to write a credible RFP. Sorry, yes.
Just to follow on that, I hear everything you're saying, and I agree with you, because from all of the private bidders will do their own study, but the government doesn't necessarily ever get a copy of their studies. And if the private sector is going into the negotiation table and they've got a bankable study, but the government doesn't, you know, there's so much importance on having a very good contract that balances. You know, in a sense, I know that the TDA projects, it's hard because it's a U.S. company that's done it, and if it's an international project, how that all works. But there is a benefit for the government to have a bankable study, so they go into the table with solid numbers and performance measures and all of that.
You're absolutely right. That's a very, very good point. It's a very good point. Now, the way I would answer that is, I'm talking about a bankable feasibility study, okay, where you need to document a lot of stuff. You need to have evidentiary material for the bank to be able to exert its fiduciary responsibilities in letting you have the financing. And that's, that is a different level of expense you're talking about. What you do is you do an appraisal, which is you do a lot of the feasibility work, the analysis over here. It's not just the back of the envelope.
An appraisal, so it's part of the MOU.
You do all the data. You know a lot of the analysis that the feasibility study will have, but you don't have to document it.
Right.
It doesn't have to be a legally, what's the word for it? There's a word for it, I forget.
Bankable.
Bankable is the layman's term, but there's a legal word for it. The evidentiary aspect of it is not needed,
I see what you
other than just for internal board, for your own board or whatever. So that's the difference, and the cost differential of those two are quite significant.
You're right.
You see, that's what I'm talking
I see.
about. You do need to do the analysis.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, that's it. Thank you, Mr. Sudhi. And
my pleasure.
there's a small token. Emil, if you would please.
Absolutely. Whoops.
I really enjoyed doing this, so thank you everybody for listening to me. How long did I take? Much longer than I should have.
People are still asking questions. That means not long at all.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for coming.